interesting opportunities that we see through these recommendations as we go through them. So again, our goal is to share these recommendations and clarify any of the points that are guiding our work. So I'm going to hand off now to Dr. Paul Foster from CDE.
Well, thank you. So one of the things I wanted to do is background. So this has been a work that has been ongoing for really this entire year. And so this is a culmination of the year-long work in response to HB 181333. So the background is really very recent. It really starts, the most recent background really starts at the beginning of this week.
You just don't notice.
The report was distributed.
Yeah. And actually, I thought the
group shared initial recommendations
I didn't. I got written up.
well, to an expanded CICC meeting.
Well,
Work group reviewed and considered, or the work group then, based on feedback that we received at that meeting, reviewed the feedback on the initial recommendations. And then we met yesterday and reviewed each of the recommendations in detail and took those recommendations that we received into consideration. And so for those of you who are at that meeting, you'll see some of the recommendations have changed in response to the feedback we received. And so at this point, we will now jump into the recommendations and begin to walk through those recommendations.
Hi everyone, this is Christy Scott, and as Melissa stated earlier, we want to be sure that the intent behind the final recommendations that we are presenting to you is clear. If you are not sure what's meant as we go through these, please write your question in the chat box. The chat box is going to be monitored and questions will be answered if it's a question that we can provide some clarity. If we can answer a question that needs to provide some clarification of the understanding of a recommendation, we will do that. If not, we'll record the question and we will keep it on record as we continue forward with our work around these recommendations. After reviewing and considering the feedback received by stakeholders, which precipitated robust discussion within the interagency work group, recommendation number 1 was revised. And the background behind this recommendation is that since July 2006, CDHS has been the lead agency for Part C of IDEA, with the responsibility for all activities from referral through transition, including early intervention evaluation. Since 2007, special education administrative units have been mandated under the Exceptional Children's Education Act to conduct early intervention evaluations. The departments agree that the future administrative structure must give CDHS authority for monitoring, enforcement, and correction of early intervention evaluations as required under Part C of IDEA. So joint recommendation number 1. Ensure CDHS has the authority for monitoring, enforcement, and correction of early intervention evaluations, which may include a change to state education statute. By November 1, 2019, with stakeholder input, select the administrative structure that ensures CDHS has the authority for monitoring, enforcement, and correction of early intervention evaluations, which includes a planned transition process.
Are there any questions coming in related to recommendation 1 before we move on to 2?
Not so far, but if anything comes through, I'll give a heads up.
Great. All right. Seeing no questions related to recommendation number 1 at this point, we'll move on to 2. This is Heidi McCaslin speaking. We did not change recommendation number 2. The recommendation reads that we will create a task force of EI evaluation stakeholders to work with the departments on the implementation of the EIE recommendations. Did want to note that some of the feedback that we received on this recommendation certainly will be considered when seating task force members, which related to ensuring that parents are a stakeholder group represented, and that we look at the diversity of parents and providers when seating the task force, which we certainly will do.
All right. Joint recommendation number 3. After a review of stakeholder feedback on this recommendation, it was revised to provide clarity. Extend the agreements within the interagency agreement required by House Bill 18-1333 beyond June 30th, 2019. This may include formalizing the turnback policy, revising timelines, providing evaluations in families' homes, and increasing access to evaluations and funding. Any questions related to this recommendation?
Nothing so far.
All right, moving on to joint recommendation number 4. This recommendation has not changed since we shared it with the folks in our Wednesday meeting. This one reads, review and refine CDHS early intervention data collection so that all needed information about the evaluation process is collected. For example, family satisfaction, location of evaluation, whether the activity documented was an evaluation or assessment, and information on developmental screening if conducted.
So no question on this one, but we do have one related to joint recommendation number 3, and it's what is meant by increasing access to funding.
Would you like me to respond? Sure. This is Heidi. I'll begin to respond to that one, and then others in the room may want to add to that as well. The idea is there that the additional funds that were generated under this House bill work as a new line in the early intervention program could be maximized by utilizing those funds for all evaluations and or screening activities rather than just those that were a part of the pilot process, as one example of increasing access to funding. Yes, share another example.
Yeah, that was when we talk about extending the agreement, we wanted to make sure that we are continuing to support the evaluations and as Heidi said, accessing the funds that are available right now without putting such strict guidelines around how they might be used so that we can relieve the capacity of the system in regards to those early intervention evaluations and use all of the early intervention funding that's available.
I also want to reiterate, this is Heidi, that the intention also is with the stakeholder task force to be getting implementation information and advice from this task force throughout all of the implementation of the recommendations that are being made today.
Okay, no additional questions.
Okay. So
Nothing on
we're moving on to 5.
So joint recommendation 5, there were no changes made to this one as well. So integrate ongoing standardized data collection of the family experience in regard to the EI evaluation, including data in relation to best practice. No questions related to this one.
So we'll move on to joint recommendation number 6. This one also did not change. This one says to fund and implement options for post-referral developmental screening prior to an early intervention evaluation.
No questions coming through on number 6.
All right, moving on to joint recommendation number 7. After reviewing stakeholder feedback, this recommendation was revised to provide some clarity. Use early intervention funds to pay for early intervention evaluations, including Medicaid where possible. EIE dollars currently used for early intervention evaluations should be reallocated for special education services for children over 3 years old. Are there any questions regarding recommendation number 7?
Nothing coming through.
Moving on to joint recommendation number 8. This one has not changed since we presented on Wednesday. This one says, identify standards of practice in the use of early intervention evaluation tools and provide professional development for the consistent administration of these tools.
Nothing coming through on number 8.
All right, moving on to our final joint recommendation, number 9. This recommendation was changed based on stakeholder feedback to be clear that we are speaking of personnel shortages, which has been expressed as a concern by stakeholders, and not the expertise of providers. The previous recommendation, number 8, addresses the professional development. So the joint recommendation is to address personnel shortages to conduct EI evaluations.
We'll pause for a moment to see if there are questions coming in that could be responded to with regard to any of the recommendations.
Yeah, so we have one. Will recommendations 8 and 9 be addressed by the task force?
It's our intent that the task force would advise and support the departments in implementing all 9 of the recommendations.
Nothing else related to number 9, or I guess in general.
So we would also invite you, if you don't have a clarifying question, but you want to share some input or feedback for us to consider as we move forward, you're welcome to do that. We won't be addressing those types of questions during the webinar today, but we'll continue to be mindful of the information that's shared by stakeholders as we move forward.
And we do have a general question. What's the timeline for implementation of the recommendations?
Well, I think the input, hi, this is Paul. I think that, once the report is sent to the JBC, those recommendations will begin being implemented immediately. Some of them may have, I guess, a different timeline in terms of when you would see those things actually occurring in the field. But in terms of general implementation of the recommendations, that will begin immediately upon producing it to the JBC. So,
yeah. And you heard from us on Wednesday that we are anticipating that the report would be revised or updated rather and resubmitted in early fall with the cost data information. There's also, as you noted, recommendation number 1 actually has a time frame in it for some additional decision making that would occur with stakeholder input. So in order for all of that to unfold the way we expect, that stakeholder task force would need to be seated coming up soon here.
Okay. The question, will this also include recommendations for assessment standards and methods for adequate training?
I'm wondering if that question is in reference to assessment versus evaluation. will you just read the question one more time, Chris?
Yeah, it's, will this also include recommendations for assessment standards and methods for adequate training?
I think I think if I'm understanding, we're talking about assessment after evaluation is conducted and eligibility is determined, which these recommendations are addressing evaluation activities only. If there's additional need for assessment, professional development, then that's something that we would tackle under a different set of activities.
And this is Laura. One of the things that we'll ask the task force to advise us on is when we're thinking of evaluation, how does that fit within the process that includes moving towards assessment? So in that way, we will be considering how to support assessment activities through the use of the evaluation tool as well.
And this person did specify they were referring specifically to evaluations.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Professional development will be addressed as far in relation to evaluation.
And then we have a couple of questions coming through along the lines of how will these recommendations be distributed and posted for public access?
I guess I'm going, this is Christy. Once the report to the Joint Budget Committee is completed and submitted to the Joint Budget Committee, then it becomes public, and the complete report will be available in multiple areas, and we'll let everybody know where they can be found.
Yeah, all of the communications lists that we have for stakeholders that are involved today, as well as our general list of stakeholders, we'll certainly announce that through those distribution methods. It's likely that we would also share information on relevant web pages and that kind of thing. As a note, we did just receive from the study vendor all of the appendices for the study report. So those will be added to the study, and those will be made available as well.
So no other questions have come through.
So, we'll move on to the next step.
Alrighty. So this is Melissa, and we'll go ahead and close our time together. Some of you already asked a little bit about this, but our immediate next step is to finalize and submit our report to the JBC, which is taking these recommendations and elaborate on them a bit. We will be releasing that JBC report to our stakeholders. And this work group that we introduced at the very beginning will be continuing to meet in order to implement recommendations. And we will have an updated report with the cost study findings submitted to the JBC in the early fall. So this work continues with the intent of supporting children and families with a supportive experience. So we appreciate your involvement in this work. We know that many of you will continue to be involved as we move forward, and we invite your continued support as well as engagement.
Okay.
Thank you all.
I think that wraps it up. No further comments or anything in the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See you, everyone.